colleagues in Columbia, Maryland, from the North American Division. So I'm really glad to be here in South America, only my second time in South America. But it's also very dangerous for me to be here in South America. Why? Because for a very, very long time, people have always assumed, without asking, that I speak another language, and especially Spanish. Español. I can't tell you how many people just walk up to me and begin speaking to me in Spanish. So my wife, who does speak Spanish, taught me one line to use. So if I were to ever be in one of those situations, this would be my line. Here it is. Lo siento, pero no hablo español. The problem is that it doesn't always work. One time, there was a lady who came up to me, speaking to me in Spanish right away. I waited for a break in the conversation. Then I said, lo siento, pero no hablo español. And she laughed and kept speaking to me in Spanish. So it doesn't always work. All right, well, speaking of my wife, let me see if my remote works here. And we'll go to our presentation, but this is my wonderful family, my wife Leah, and then our oldest son Roman in the middle, and our youngest son Lance on the far left there. Where are they this summer? I know you're thinking that. They are in Hawaii for 5 weeks with grandma and grandpa. So my wife and I decided to send them as missionaries to Hawaii for summer vacation. And the really sad part is that Leah and I have never even been to Hawaii. So our kids, who are spending 5 weeks there, are going to come back with amazing Hawaii experiences that we've never experienced. Anyhow, that is my family, and they send you their greetings as well. So let's talk about Adventist Review Ministries. So here, what we're going to do today, just to let you know, is we're going to spend just a few minutes giving an overview of what Adventist Review Ministries is, and then specifically we're going to talk about the digital transformation that Adventist Review Ministries has been on over the last 3 years or so. But let's begin with this picture. So take a very, very good look at this picture, because this is one of the earliest pictures of the publication of the Adventist Review. Now, I don't know how many of you know that the Adventist Review magazine was the first Adventist anything. 14 years before the church became an organization in 1863, the Adventist Review was printed. In fact, it was the very, very first manifestation of our denomination. That's why we say the Adventist Review magazine was the first Adventist anything. And what you see here is not a picture of James White, who was the first one to publish the Adventist Review in 1849, but this is Uriah Smith. This is the second Adventist Review editor. 1849 is when it started. Now, back then, it was called something different. The Adventist Review began as The Present Truth. And then, little by little, it changed titles 2 or 3 times until it was finally settled that it would be called the Adventist Review. But here, you're looking at the very first page of the very first magazine that the Seventh-day Adventist Church ever produced. Only years before, 14 years before, it was an actual organization. Here's a close-up of the page. It's just a little bit pixelated, but I think you may be able to make it out. There it is, published semi-monthly by James White in Middletown, Connecticut, July 1849. Well, this year, by the way, we are celebrating 170 years of the Adventist Review, and as you can tell, July, which means we're just a couple of days from celebrating the 170th year of the very first Adventist anything, the Adventist Review magazine. Now, over 170 years later, times have changed, and the Adventist Review has had to change as well. So, on that note, ladies and gentlemen, I want to introduce you to the new Adventist Review. Oh, if James White and Uriah Smith could only see this short little video. They couldn't even imagine what their little publication, what their little paper would end up being. Why? Because at Adventist Review, we're every day attempting to be as relevant as we possibly can for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of the kingdom. All right, so let's take a look at some of the elements of the very new and reimagined Adventist Review. These are some of the divisions, some of the areas of Adventist Review Ministries. Adventist World Magazine, Adventist Review Magazine. We'll talk about these just in a little bit. Kids View Magazine, AR TV, which we'll spend a lot of time with, AR Audio, and the AR Media Lab. So we begin with the flagship Adventist Review. This is the magazine that was started by James White, and it is a subscription magazine. In other words, it's a paid subscription magazine, and it is now available not only in print, but also online and on social media. Now, the next magazine you may be even more familiar with, it's called the Adventist World. About 15 years ago, the Adventist World was born out of nothing. And the Adventist World was intended to be a magazine that was shared free of charge around the world so that people in many different languages could have the same conversations about the same important topics. And so the Adventist Review staff produces both the monthly Adventist Review and the monthly Adventist World. This magazine is currently available in 10 different languages, and you can see the languages there, and other languages as well, as people are translating the Adventist World content in ways that we're not even aware of. And of course, we are working even on more languages. The next one up is Swahili. We are very interested in developing a Swahili language. All right. One of the things that we take very seriously at Adventist World is news. As you can see here, we redeveloped the Adventist World website and included for the very first time a way to look at news from around the world with the divisions each having their own news within the Adventist World environment. The second thing that we did is to create categories, and you can see them there on the left-hand side. We all know that categorization, segmentation, is extremely critical in today's world. It's actually not optional because readers want to pursue their own interests, right? That's, by the way, something we'll talk about this afternoon for those of you who attend the journalism workshop. But for now, just know that we have segmented our news in many, many different categories, all the way from crisis to education, health, profiles, science, so that if you're interested in a particular kind of Adventist news, you have it all there. So here are just some statistics that give you just 2 or 3 elements of our operation at Adventist Review Ministries. 18.5 million magazines were printed last year, both Adventist Review and Adventist World. 730 plus digital news stories were published on both platforms. We have over 500,000 followers on Facebook in AR and AW, or Adventist Review and Adventist World. And then finally, over 860,000 minutes of content were viewed on AR TV last year. So let's talk about this just a little bit more. We also have, as you saw earlier, a Kids View magazine. And this magazine is based off of the Adventist Review magazine, but specifically for kids in schools. And so we have a distribution partnership in North America. This little magazine goes to schools all over North America. And we've also started discussions with India. So India is very interested in getting all of these magazines, or should I say this magazine, in all of their Adventist schools in India. So it's very exciting to see what the possibilities of Kids View are. Now that we've talked about some of the more traditional print magazines, here's the question that we get asked all the time. In fact, I think I get asked this question almost every single week. And you probably ought to be asking yourself the same question, because many of us have something to do with a print magazine or maybe a print newsletter that is still being distributed. The question is, what is the future of the print magazine? So this is the question that we've been struggling with for 3 years. In a very open way, in a very transparent way. The editors have looked at a lot of data, and we have considered a lot of possibilities. And believe me, there is pressure on both sides. So there are a whole lot of people who say, you have to keep printing the paper. And then there are others who say, paper is gone and you have to stop printing on paper. It literally, we're squeezed between these two camps. So here's what we've discovered after 3 years of struggling with this question. The magazine market isn't dead, it's different. Just think about this for just a second. The magazine market is not dead, it is just different. So if you want to argue with the fact that the magazine market is either alive or dead, I simply invite you to go to your nearest airport and go to the nearest convenience store, one of those little stores where they sell drinks and chips and magazines, and just take a look at the number of magazines all around the world that are still being printed. We live right now in a both-and world. Right? In other words, what that means is we don't live in an either-or world. You can't just be all print or all digital. The reality is that we, right now, in the year 2019, live still in a both-and world. So realizing this, we are attempting not to do away with the paper copy of Adventist Review and Adventist World, but to reimagine it, to supplement it with ways that are very, very unique, that allow the paper magazine to still serve its needs while at the same time reaching a whole new audience that lives basically just in the digital world. All right, so on that note, let me tell you a little bit about ARTV, Adventist Review Television. This was one of our main responses to our struggle, our conversation about the future of the magazine. And we clearly see the same statistics that you see, that we are dealing with not only just a generation, but a media landscape that really, really wants to ingest, wants to consume a lot of video content. A lot of video content. So not only did we not have a choice, but we were very excited to launch ARTV, which would allow us to explore these ways of storytelling that were digital in nature, and we created an on-demand platform called ARTV. Now, here are some of the statistics that we saw as we were thinking about this. Now, take a good look at this. This is the number of hours spent on a smartphone every day, and look at globally. All right, this is not a U.S. statistic. This is a global statistic. Notice on the very left that less than 4%, or should we say 4%, spend less than 1 hour on their smartphone, right? An entire 26% of the world's population, that's a quarter of the world's population, spends more than 7 hours a day on their smartphone. An entire quarter of the world. Here's a second statistic that we were looking at. Look at the daily media consumption by type, again, globally. You can begin to see on the left-hand side that online media time is at 6 hours and 45 minutes. And then broadcast TV, way low, broadcast radio, game consoles. And then if you break up the online on the right-hand side, you'll see there that online TV, right? That's an hour and 10 minutes just of online. This is average around the world, average, just on online TV. And then, of course, you can see how that breaks down. Music streaming services and online press, social media, etc., etc. These are some of the things that we looked at, and then we launched ARTV, so that we could explore content in a way that was digital. These are some screenshots from ARTV Now. So it's basically, if you're interested to see some of it, ARTV Now, N-O-W, ARTV Now. And here you can see that we are available, ARTV is, on all platforms everywhere. In other words, all platforms, all devices are friendly to AR. Here's some of the screenshots later on. I'll tell you about 14th and You, a very interesting show that we launched with Clifford Goldstein and Dwayne Esmond. And then, of course, you can see here a number of different categories that we offer, so that we can supplement and work with the content that we also have in the magazines. All right, well, with that, let's take a look at some samples from ARTV programming, and then we'll watch more later. But for now, let's just watch a couple of samples.
What can we do? It takes leadership, such as the Pope's encyclical.
We're going to experience climate change, and we better get ready for it, and we're not.
Even now, it's not something that's happening in 50 years or 100 years, but now.
A time of trouble is coming, such as the world has never seen before.
It's a known fact that kids like candy.
Don't you want some candy?
No. It's not as good for you.
Says who?
It's a natural source of vitamin D. The human body makes 90% of its vitamin D from the skin's exposure to sunlight.
Basically, the SUN is the light of our lives, just like Christians believe the SON is the light of their lives.
I don't want to hear it. We're going to close the windows, keep out the fresh air, close the blinds, keep out the sun.
Which sun? The SUN or the SON?
Both.
Human beings can be so cruel towards so many animals.
When you have the opportunity to look into their eyes, to know their stories.
Animals that are rescued here can be released into the wild again, where they're really meant to live. I hope people get inspired and treat animals with more care and respect.
Today, there is only a vague understanding of the one seminal act that took place 500 years ago, echoing throughout the world, primed for Renaissance. Perhaps we're already wandering in the darkness and don't even realize it.
The protest is over.
Should you care? There are at least 95 reasons why you should.
So there are, thank you. So there are 10 values around which we developed ARTV. The first value was on demand, and I'll share with you just briefly some statistics that you may find interesting as well, as hopefully you continue in South America to develop more and more VOD content, video on demand content. Let's look at the first one. Nearly 2/3 of global respondents, 65%, say, from 61 countries, say that they watch some form of video on demand programming, which includes long and short form content. Look at this next slide. This is the amount of time, in other words, daily, a few times per week, or 3 times per month or less, that people in different age categories take in video on demand content. Clearly, you can see that the Generation Z and the millennials, anywhere from 15 years old to 34 years old, half of them consume video on demand content daily, every single day, video on demand content. And even if you look at the 65 plus, the people who are over 65 years old, 60% of them, an entire 60% of them, view video on demand content, average globally, a few times per week. Here's another one. So these are, again, the age categories, the Generation Z, Millennials, Generation X, and look at on the right-hand side, that is the percentage of them that are ready right now to cancel their cable subscriptions and just consume video on demand. So you can see to generate 40% of them instantly are ready to get rid of cable. And then, of course, the percentages go down as the ages go up. But you can see how many people are wanting to live unplugged, right? Unplugged from their cable subscription or their satellite subscription. Here is an interesting statistic just from the United States, but very telling. What do people do during prime time, that time in the evening when everyone is watching television? During prime time hours of an average day in the U.S., more 18 to 49-year-olds visit YouTube than any other network. So all of our big networks that are linear television in the United States, more people visit YouTube than any other network during prime time. That's when the best shows on television are on. All right, let's take a look at this one. This one is very new. This was just released. It's very hard to see down here, but June of 2019. This is as recent as it gets. This is the video on demand market all over the world, and you can see that there's a clear growth, and you can see that in 2019, that market is a $32 billion US dollar market all over the world, $32 billion US dollars. So this is why we decided to go for video on demand. There you can see the penetration, which means the percentage of people in a population who are using it. Here are the top 5 countries. So this is as of the last few months. Sweden takes the cake. The most amount of people in Sweden, 38.6%, are actually taking in on a regular basis video on demand content. You can see some of the other countries. And then I included there all of the countries that I believe are the main countries represented in the South American division. I'm sorry if I missed one, but there you can see your country and the video on demand penetration rate in your country. So these are the things that really convinced us that video on demand is the way of the future. And at some point in time, more and more people will begin to cut their cable, and which means that we all need to imagine new and creative ways to tap into that video on demand market. But remember, we are still in a both and world. Both and, which means that a lot of us still have and very much value our cable subscriptions, our linear television. I love linear television personally, but we also have our subscriptions to video on demand, right? So this is still a both and world. The second value that we based our ARTV development on is field production. So this is an area where we kind of struggle as Adventists, because we really have done a lot of studio production, and studio-based production is great. If it's done well, it's really fantastic. And guess what? It's more predictable and it's cheaper. Right? All of us who have produced television know that to produce something inside of a studio is less expensive and more predictable, and if it's well done, yes, let's continue doing it. However, at ARTV, we're trying to force ourselves out of the studio and into the street. We're trying to force ourselves out of the studio and into the field, where some really interesting things are happening in this world, and we want to capture those interesting things. So that is the third value. The next value is essentially short and shareable. Now, this goes without saying. In other words, we know that we live in a new reality where short and shareable is very valuable. Now, remember, long format content is also very valuable on certain platforms. So in other words, if you have a Netflix subscription, all of you watch shows that are 30 minutes in length, 90 minutes in length, documentaries that last 2 hours. All of us do that. However, when it comes to especially social media platforms, short and shareable is very, very critical. And so here are some of the things that we looked at, some of the statistics again. Take a good look because you may find these interesting as well. So this is essentially real-time data from these various social media platforms and how much time for each video on average that had the greatest amount of engagement, right? In other words, if you want to reach people, engagement is the magic marker. And take a look, Instagram, 30 seconds. Twitter, 45 seconds. These were average lengths of videos that got the most amount of engagement. Facebook, 1 minute, and then YouTube, 2 minutes. Now, YouTube, of course, you can find very long format content, but the content that got the most amount of engagement, this is an engagement analysis, was a 2-minute piece on YouTube. So here are some of the ways in which we are trying to tap into the short and shareable value from ARTV. The first one is a news interview show in which we take various people within the Adventist Church who are making news, who are part of something big, something newsworthy, right? And we're doing very short interviews. This is 10 minutes or less, and in fact, we're probably trying to get it even shorter than that. But 10 minutes or less, quick, short, and shareable interviews. And here's just a couple of seconds of this one, and you may just recognize the person who is being interviewed. Welcome to Newsmakers, a series created to put you in closer touch with Seventh-day Adventists who are making news around the world. All right. Thank you, Pastor Rafael, for doing that interview. If you want to see the entire interview, all you have to do is go to AdventistReview.org, and it's there. It's one of the first things that you'll see. We just posted it, I think, yesterday. Thank you again for doing that interview. So that's one of the ways that we're trying to do short and shareable. Here's another way. So Pastor Bill Knott is the executive editor of Adventist Review and Adventist World magazines. He is the current James White, the current Uriah Smith. And one of the things that he does every single week, and he started this voluntarily, is he'll send a very short, what we call a grace note, a note about grace, a grace note, to thousands of people around the world. And he was just doing this on his cell phone. Well, once we began to understand how valuable these messages about grace were around the world, we packaged it in very unique ways. So you can see here, one of the ways is with very social media friendly memes that go out all over our social media platforms and are very, very popular. He also reads them. So these are very short, very, very short messages. He also reads them with his own voice, and that is also made available. And then we chose several of them, and this was a pilot project, and then we recorded little in the field versions of these grace notes. So once again, you'll see a very short clip where we've edited down for the sake of time, but you'll get an idea of what these grace notes look like.
Not everyone thinks the grace of God is good news. Sounds hard to believe, I know, but trust me when I say it's true. Grace is rarely welcome news or even sweet to those intent on documenting their effort. So get over your pride. Get over yourself. Accept the cross. Embrace the cross. And stay in grace.
So this is under 2 minutes. It's always about 2 minutes or under, and you just saw 25 seconds of it, again, because of the lack of time that we have this morning to see all of them. Here's the next value, Adventist Plus audience. Now, you ask, what is Adventist Plus? Well, we understand that everything we produce will be seen and appreciated, we hope, by Seventh-day Adventists around the world. But we've added that plus to remind us that everything we do is really intended to introduce Jesus to someone else. That's what it all boils down to introduce Jesus to someone else, and in this case, people who are not Seventh-day Adventists around the world. And so we always are thinking with the external audience in mind, not just with the Christian external audience, but with the general external audience, someone who may not even have faith in God, who can take in some of this content, and it would make them think, right? The Adventist Plus audience. So what I'm about to show you next is one of our latest releases, our latest series that we have thought through with this Adventist Plus audience in mind. It's called 14th and U, as in 14th and U, but this is an intersection in Washington, D.C., very close to the Capitol, to the White House. It's 14th Street and U, the letter U, and so it becomes, the name of this show is 14th and U, issues that matter to you. So essentially, we send a crew to Washington, D.C., and we record a lot of man on the street, or vox pops, you may have called them, where we interview people on the street about the latest global issues, about the latest national issues there in the United States, and then we take those interviews back, and we take 2 or 3 of them, and we feed them to 2 very interesting and animated hosts. The first one you may have heard of more, and his name is Clifford Goldstein. Very, very prolific author and a very unique character. If you ever see Clifford Goldstein giving a lecture, you will never fall asleep. I guarantee it's impossible to fall asleep. He's very animated and very passionate about what he talks about, and we partnered him together with an equally passionate and animated member of our team there at the General Conference who works for the Ellen White Estate, and his name is Dwayne Esmond. So these 2 get together in a cafe scene to discuss these issues. So once again, let's take a look at just a very short segment of how we're taking global and national realities there in the United States and globally, and allowing these 2 to talk about them and then to bring about some kind of spiritual perspective on the matter, some kind of Adventist perspective on the matter. Let's take a look at 14th and U.
Yeah, I know. Well, no, she's used to it now.
She's used to it?
Yeah.
How many years you guys been married?
33, going on 33.
That's awesome.
Yeah, 34 going on. Yeah.
Wow,
Thank
that's
you.
a blessing. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Of course.
You know, I wonder if we've got anybody in this country who still believes like they could be off the grid. Like,
Well, they believe it because they try it. But I mean, they got satellites, man. The satellites.
Watching us, right?
Yeah, they got satellites. 30 years ago, I remember Gorbachev complaining the Americans had satellites that could read license plate numbers off cars.
Yes,
they
sir.
can do that.
And that was years ago. So
now.
today we're in a whole different realm.
Oh, they know.
I'm just wondering, like,
Big Brother's watching.
Big Brother's watching. I wonder if everyone has that feeling, like that surveillance is a real deal, and it might be some interesting ideas and things that people think on the street. I wonder what the man on the street thinks.
I'm
if
sure
we think
they
this way.
think about it.
Okay, let's see.
So I really don't have any problem with the surveillance part.
I am quite concerned about the heightened level of surveillance that we're finding through the products that are made available to us
I think that there is reason to be concerned about how much surveillance we're experiencing.
So these people are concerned, and we are talking about it here. So I'm wondering, there's got to be like some legitimate reasons for surveillance.
Of course there is. You know how many crimes have been solved because the cameras are there?
All right, so that's 14th and U. And just a short snippet, again, those are all available at AdventistReview.org. Now, in the interest of time, because I see our time's going by, this is very quickly some of the other values, cultural intersections. So these are some of the most popular things on YouTube, some of those popular videos on Facebook. We look at these, we try to figure out how to intersect with those. Then, of course, we look at audience point of view. We want to know what the audience thinks about something. 14th and U is a very good example of that, rather than just what we as producers think of that. Then, of course, we have narrative content. Narrative content is once again one of those genres that we as Adventists don't produce a lot of, and we should produce more of it, because you may be familiar with the fact that 1/3 of everything Jesus said, at least that's what's captured in the Gospels, was a narrative. In other words, 1/3 of what Jesus spoke was a parable, right? So we need to tell these modern parables. Let's take a look now at one of the projects that we've done in Morocco with several partners who came together to film a number of different scenes of the life of Daniel. I think you'll be very, very interested to see this clip as well, the book of Daniel. Let's take a look. Oops. So that is the book of Daniel that's coming up. Very quickly, we're very data-driven. Everything we do is by looking at the numbers and making informed decisions. Mobile first is another one of our values. Memorable experiences. Walt Disney changed the world forever because he introduced the world to the unforgettable experience. And so now, if you're not creating unforgettable experiences, you're dead in the water. You're irrelevant. So we try to create memorable experiences. We work with partners all the time. If you're very interested in partnering, let your division know, and they'll let us know. Everything we do is in audio. And the very, very last thing I'll show you is our AR Media Lab. This is perhaps the most unique aspect of our operation, and that is we have an innovation lab, and we've hired a gentleman by the name of Daryl Gungadu. Some of you have known Daryl for quite some time, an incredibly intelligent person, and he leads our our media lab. So what we're doing now is we're actually experimenting with augmented reality and with virtual reality. Here's an augmented reality piece that comes right out of the magazine for the Kids View audience. And if I had more time, I'd show you more. This is essentially a walkthrough of the temple. I'm sorry, not the temple, but the city gates leading to Babylon. We won't watch the entire clip, but you can see all of this was created from scratch for a virtual reality game. And then the very last thing that I'd like to show you is for the Oshkosh Camporee that happens in North America. So 40,000 Pathfinders will be there, and they'll all be focusing on the story of David and Goliath. And so our media lab, our innovation team, created a virtual reality game for the Camporee, and as well as an augmented reality. So with very expensive goggles, the entire scene that you're about to see comes alive on a table in front of you, and you can interact with this, or you can choose to do it virtual reality. So this is a scene of David and Goliath created once again from absolute scratch, from nothing, created for the Camporee. This is the last thing we'll see. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the new Adventist Review.
Muchas gracias. Vamos a tener momentos para preguntarle a Costin, así que por favor le pedimos. Vamos a hacerle dos preguntas, ¿sí? Estamos con el tiempo corriendo. Tenemos allí los micrófonos disponibles para que puedan hacer una pregunta.
Costin, do you have translator here?
Sí, tiene el traductor.
It was working. Give me just one second. I could hear it, and now I can't. Yes, I can hear it. Thank you.
Okay. Very good. Thanks for coming. Obrigado por vir. Sorry. Obrigado por vir aqui à América do Sul. Agradeço. Naquele dia da entrevista foi que a gente combinou a vinda dele para cá. É bom tê-lo aqui. Nós gravamos aqui no GAiN Mundial, onde pudemos falar um pouquinho sobre o que a América do Sul tem feito. Mas deixa eu fazer uma pergunta. Eu quero parabenizá-lo por todas as iniciativas e é bom ver a Adventist Review assim à frente, puxando, inovando, porque é um veículo mais do que centenário e agora usando tecnologia. Como é que você vê a América do Sul diante dessas inovações que vocês estão fazendo lá? Como a gente pode ajudar a potencializar tudo aquilo que vocês estão produzindo?
So, thank you, Pastor Rafael. The idea of partnerships and synergy is very important to us at Adventist Review. We are not an island. In fact, James White never intended for this to be one magazine published by one person in one room. It was always intended to involve the Adventist world. And so your invitation we're very happy to receive it and to figure out more tangible ways in which we can partner. Everybody knows that the South American division has an incredibly well-developed infrastructure for this type of work. And so it only makes sense for us to continue to talk about different ways in which we can partner. And as you can see, we're open to just about everything. We're not scared by any idea, no matter how innovative it is. If it's going to be effective for introducing one more person to Jesus, then we're interested.
Excelente. Tenemos una pregunta más. Por acá. ¿No? Estamos. Le damos un fuerte aplauso. Gracias. Gracias por acompañarnos. Costin, Jordache. Bien, momento ahora sí de pasar a las oficinas. Vamos a dividirnos en grupos. Ustedes están viendo aquí en la pantalla todos los que son asesores de comunicación van a quedarse aquí en el auditorio, ¿sí? Los que son de Media Center, multimedia, van para allí, para las oficinas de Media Center. Los departamentales de comunicación, de uniones, de campos, van entonces para la sala 2A. Y en la sala 1A, las personas que son y que trabajan con las redes sociales, ¿sí? Exclusivamente la gente que trabaja con las redes sociales. Así que después de este taller, el programa continúa aquí, así que los esperamos nuevamente en este lugar. Vamos a volver aquí luego entonces de los talleres.
Alô. Boa tarde, amigos. Vamos nos concentrar aqui um pouquinho mais próximos. Aqui. Não há necessidade de ficarmos tão longe. Todos aqueles que vão ficar nesse lugar, por favor, se concentrem mais aqui ao centro, para a gente ficar mais próximo. Vamos então agora ouvir o Costin. Costin vai falar um pouquinho sobre jornalismo e a igreja. E vai falar também sobre relações públicas, vai falar sobre assuntos relacionados a isso. Então é muito importante para quem trabalha com a comunicação, para vocês terem uma ideia de como isso também é visto em nível mundial da igreja. Então é uma oportunidade importante. Vamos prestar bastante atenção, vamos participar, porque além de ser um convidado que vem de longe, é um convidado também que traz uma visão que os outros convidados não podem trazer, que é a visão mundial. Então essa é uma oportunidade muito, muito importante. Inclusive eu vou resgatar alguns irmãos que insistem em ficar lá fora e que estarão aqui dentro logo. Eu os buscarei para que estejam aqui conosco também e aproveitem esse precioso momento que a igreja oportuniza para todos nós aqui. Então, Costin, que é pastor, é um profissional com formação em marketing, com formação em cinema, com formação em administração. Então, é uma pessoa preparada para nos ajudar. Com você, Costin.
Thank you, Pastor Felipe. I think I'll move this just a little bit closer, because this is more of an in-depth workshop on the topic of journalism. So, as we begin to set the scene, what we're going to discuss, as Pastor Felipe mentioned in his introduction, is journalism, but we're also going to talk about the difference between journalism and public relations, which is a very specific distinction and difference, and why it matters. And then we're going to talk about the Seventh-day Adventist Church, our Seventh-day Adventist Church, and how it relates to these areas of journalism and public relations. I hope that this will be a very practical workshop for you, because we are doing many wonderful things in the Adventist Church in terms of public relations and journalism, but we have a long way to go. We have a lot of work to do to get to where we really, really need to be. So let's look at some of these concepts together, and I will look at this time clock and try to leave us enough time for questions and answers, because it becomes very critical for you to ask very open questions about this topic. Okay, so let's begin by looking at some issues. The first thing that we want to do is to give a general definition of journalism. And here it is. Journalism is the activity of gathering, assessing, take a very good look at that word, assessing, creating, and presenting news and information. So just let it sink in just a little bit. Journalism is the activity of gathering, assessing, creating, and presenting news and information. Now here is a short list of what we could call the role of journalism. The role of journalism. We begin at the top with the very most important one, and that is to keep the public informed. Right? If you ever wonder why do you do what you do, as a communicator, as a journalist in this case, it is that we have a responsibility to keep our audience informed. In this case, in our case, our primary audience are the Seventh-day Adventists that make up our church in our community, in our conference, in our union, in our division, and around the world. We have a responsibility to keep them informed. Number 2, to gather news and information. You saw that in the definition. 3rd, to assess and to analyze the information. Pay very close attention because we're getting to some very critical concepts here. To assess and to analyze the information. In other words, to make sense of the information for your readers, for your audience. Next one, to communicate the information in a fair and balanced way. You can already begin to see that we're going to have some really great conversation over the next hour and some here. To communicate in a fair and balanced way, and then to make available various perspectives and opinions on the news and information. Wow. All right. So, here is something that I was taught 20 years ago when I took my very first course on communication, journalism, mass media. This is what the professor said, and it was shocking to me because prior to that, I had been fairly naive about the world in which we lived. And here's what he said: every single news outlet on the planet is biased. Right? And as like an aspiring young professional, that was that was shattering to me. What do you mean every single media outlet and organization is biased? And here is the philosophy. All news sources are biased because behind every news source is a what? A group of people. And every person on the face of the planet, including you and including me, we all have our biases. So in the end, you really can't have a purely objective news organization because that news organization is run by people who have biases. So here's our goal. Our goal in journalism is to be, number 1, aware of this and aware of our biases and aware of the biases of our news organization, and then to be as objective as possible. Right? Anything else beyond that would be Disneyland. But the reality is that we have to be as objective as possible in the world in which we live. Now, let's put a pause there and let's go to public relations. Public relations is defined like this: a strategic communication process that builds mutually beneficial relationships between organizations and their publics. This is a very necessary function for corporate communication, but public relations, pay very close attention, seeks to build positive relationships. It seeks to make a good impression on the publics on behalf of the organization. This is public relations. And it leads to mostly positive messages. Right? Are you tracking with me? Think very critically about this. Public relations, which is a very necessary function of corporate communication, tends to go mostly toward positive messages. We could even say triumphalistic messages. Everything is always great. Right? That is the goal of the public relations specialist, to create an environment in which you want to trust the organization. That's the role of a public relations specialist. Journalism, on the other hand, is never interested in making a good impression. Let me repeat that. Journalism is never interested in making a good impression. That is not the role of journalism. Journalism actually is concerned with communicating accurate facts for official press releases and statements that can be, let me repeat that. Journalism is intended to communicate accurate facts that are coming from elements like public releases and public statements that are created by public relations specialists together with other information that may be very critical for people to take in. So journalism is concerned with communicating accurate facts and assisting audiences in making sense of them. And journalists use multiple ways to gather those facts, including the partnership that journalism has with public relations. The public relations director generates the release, and the journalist takes that release and then writes an article about it. We'll talk a little bit more about that, especially if you find yourself in a situation where you're both the public relations director and the news director. That's just a little bit more than challenging. But let's take a look at a very practical example. And that is of an article. In this case, let's just take a look at a sentence that is written from the public relations perspective and then from the journalism perspective. So here it is. Public relations version of the sentence is at the top, right? The powerful evangelist inspired everybody in the room, which was filled with so many people that there was standing room only, clearly a sign of the workings of the Holy Spirit. I can't tell you how many times we receive articles that sound like this or look like this at the Adventist Review, right? But it is written from a public relations perspective. Take a look at the same sentence, now only written from a journalism perspective. Let me move out of the way so you can see it. The second one is in a room which was filled to standing room only. The evangelist inspired all those who attended, said the event organizers. This was definitely the work of the Holy Spirit, quote, said Pablo Rodriguez, pastor of the local Adventist church. Same sentence, only notice that from a journalistic perspective, the author, the voice of the author, does not inject any value judgments. You can say that the evangelist inspired everyone, but who says this? You as an author, as a journalist? Or can you quote someone, or point to someone who said it? In this case, the event organizers were very, very positive about the fact that they believed the evangelist was inspiring. And then once again, this was definitely the work of the Holy Spirit, very appropriate to put in the article about the evangelistic meeting or the revival meeting. But the author, who is also a journalist, cannot say this was definitely the work of the Holy Spirit. That is no longer a news report. Now it's a commentary. Right? But you can very quickly find someone who can tell you that if truly someone believes that this was the work of the Holy Spirit. So now let's take a look. This is just one sentence. Let's take a look now at the difference between public relations and journalism if we were to continue developing this article, right? Let me move back here this time, and I'll read from the back. Actually, no, it's very, 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 very small for me, so I'll move back over to this area here. Here it is, much better. So take a look on the left side at the top. Public relations. If this article were written from a public relations perspective, it would not mention that several businesses in the community were upset. Why were they upset? Because there were many cars parked in the neighborhood every night. Not good for their businesses. Their regular clients have no place to park, and this was a big deal at the evangelistic meetings. If you were writing the article from a public relations perspective, you would never mention that. Go to the right. If you were actually writing it as a journalist, working for the church. Now let's make very, very specific. We're not talking about a journalist working in the public media. If you are a journalist working for your conference or your union or your local church or for the division, this is how you would say it from a journalistic perspective. You would quote a member of the community who was expressing his concern, but you would also quote a church leader expressing sympathy about this issue of the cars, and that the church was discussing these concerns with the community leaders. You see? So rather than staying away from the negative part that everyone knows is a reality as part of it, and only saying what was wonderful, what was positive, The journalist looks to communicate accurate truths, but to do it in a fair and in a balanced way. So the second column allows us to do that. Let's look again on public relations. The article, if it was only written from a public relations perspective, would not mention, no way, would not mention that on average 40% of those baptized would leave the church fellowship eventually, and only focus on how many were baptized. 855 were baptized, praise the Lord, which we're all very grateful for, absolutely, and we do praise the Lord. But the public relations article would not mention this. The journalism article would mention the statistic, along with a quote from a church leader, again, admitting that the local church would have to work hard to integrate new members into the community and into the active life of the church. This is the church being given the opportunity to be proactive, to be thoughtful, right? And to be transparent. So there are some practical ways in which we can look at the difference between journalism and public relations, and this distinction is very, very critical as we discuss journalism within the Seventh-day Adventist Church. All right, so let's take a look then at the different types of journalism, and as we do, I want to tell you that at the Adventist Review and Adventist World Magazines, we standardize on Associated Press standards, AP standards. And you know what that means is that we will not publish a news article that's written from a public relations perspective. Here's what we will do. If we find a really great article that is written from a public relations perspective, if it just requires several quick little changes, we'll make those changes and turn them into a journalistic article, and then we will leave the source of the article, your name, your division, and then we'll put "and Adventist Review." So what we've done is we've shifted a couple of words that take the value judgments out of the author's mouth and place them into the organizers or the division. The division said, So in other words, this event was amazing, comma, the division said, right? Or something of that nature. Or if it requires a complete rewrite, then we will work with you and send you the copy and say, look, we like your article a lot. This is what it would have to look like if it was written in an Associated Press news style, right? So a lot of this has to do, and as you'll see in just a little bit, it has to do with being accurate and transparent and having the integrity to point to the source of a particular fact or the source of a particular sentiment or feeling. That feeling in journalism has to be ascribed to someone in as we say, pure journalism. So now let's take a look at the different types of news reporting. The first one is actually just standard news reporting, and this is a standard news report regarding the facts associated with an event or topic, focusing on the what, where, and when questions. This is your standard, this is what happened, this is how many people attended, or this was the idea and this is how the church made it happen, or this was the speech that was given and this is what was said by the person. That's your standard news reporting. Number two, there is investigative reporting. Now, in investigative reporting, you have an in-depth article that is uncovering very important aspects of a complex issue. And this type of article also begins to address the why question. Why was this done this way rather than this way? Why was the decision made to develop this program from this perspective? And so the investigative report is a little bit longer because it needs time and words to explore these types of topics. The next one is feature reporting. Feature reporting is where you take a topic and you just really develop it well. And you go really deeply into not only the topic, but the human beings behind the topic. You have a lot of human interest approaches in feature writing. The next one, you have review and commentary, which is, I mentioned it earlier, but the review and commentary is basically where you take an opinion about a particular topic, and this is based on the experience of the journalist. So you as a journalist do have a space where you can talk about your own perspectives, but it needs to be clearly from the beginning a commentary. You can review a particular initiative or a product or an event or a global issue. You can comment on it as a journalist, but from the beginning it needs to say, this is a commentary. This is my voice. I'm not speaking as an objective journalist. Then columns. Columns are basically a regular contribution by journalists who have a specialty or a passion or a skill set that they want to share with the readers. And so every month or every week or every day, it's basically blogging is a version of the columns, which are very much allowed to be opinion columns, right? The very last one is called an op-ed. You may have heard about it. It means opposite the editorial. It comes from the newspaper industry where you had the editorial page here, and on the opposite side, you had people from the community who were asked to say something about something important, right? So these op-eds. So you may want to have the division president write an op-ed. And I'm sure division presidents do this all the time. Or very important people in your community who have some kind of insight into that issue. They can write an op-ed. So there are many, many different ways in which we can segment news, and many ways in which we should begin more and more in the Adventist church to segment news. Now, let's go to the next section. We're going to talk about some trends. These are trends that are seen in journalism around the world, right? So this is not specific to the Adventist church. In fact, in the Adventist church, we have a lot of work to do to catch up with some of these concepts. But let me warn you also, some of the trends are not positive, right? Just because they're trends doesn't mean that we need to adopt the trend. And we'll actually look at both advantages and disadvantages to some of these trends. So let's take a look at the first one. The first one is called democratized journalism, right? Those quotation marks are very, very specific. Democratized journalism. This is what we call the rise of democratized journalism over the last few years because smartphones, coupled with global internet access, put together with social media platforms, have turned everyone into a potential journalist. Right? You may be experiencing these realities. You may wonder how to deal with these realities, but that's what we're up against. Smartphones, internet access, and social media platforms equal 7.4 billion potential journalists around the world. And again, there are some advantages and some disadvantages. Let's look at some advantages. Number one, you have more eyes around the world who are looking for news and developments, and they can tip off the news organization because with one little video you can say, hey, I'm in the middle of something that's critical and it's happening right now, and once I post it on my social media site, someone's going to pick it up and take it directly to a news outlet, or you may decide to tweet one of the journalists in your area, and here's what I'm experiencing. So there is a positive aspect to this idea that everyone could be a journalist, and it also includes that we have more grassroots ideas that are coming up from the ground up and opinions shared about a topic or news. It's not just the very wealthy news organizations that can tell you what you need to think about a particular topic. So to a degree, it does democratize journalism a little bit because you have grassroots opinions, people who are living in those streets, in those communities, who are able to use their voice in a very, very powerful way, in ways that they have not been able to do in the past. And then there is this idea that we can have a deeper and more meaningful engagement between news organizations and their publics. In the past, it was literally the news organization sends out the message, and then they imagine that people are engaging with it because you have so many subscriptions. But now you can actually have this two-way, meaningful dialogue and conversation with people who are actually there in the community, who are engaging with your content and providing you with additional information and content. So those are the positives, and here are a couple of journalists who are saying wonderful things about it, okay? So here it is. Mandy Velez is the social media editor at the Daily Beast, a very, very well-known organization in the United States. up until this point, the social in social media, has simply meant the platforms in which we work on. In the future, social will mean the audiences we interact with. So again, you can see that these journalists are saying we are actually appreciating the journalists around the world who are keeping us informed of various things that are happening. Here's another one. This is from Vox, another very major news outlet in the United States. Comments on articles, crowdsourced reporting, we were just talking about that, and Facebook groups aren't new ideas in journalism. What's different now is an understanding of why paying attention to community spaces is crucial to the health of the industry. Cultivating trust and loyalty. When it comes to their values, newsrooms will make the people who consume their content a priority in order to reach those goals, and that is the goals of cultivating trust and loyalty. So these journalists, these editors are saying it's important to us that we have people out in the field who think it's important for them to report from their areas. Now, there are some disadvantages as well. Pay very close attention. The disadvantages of the 7.4 billion potential journalists is that it creates very, very blurred lines in the digital space between facts, propaganda, and marketing. It is very difficult these days to tell the difference between all of those. Facts, propaganda, and marketing. And out of that, we have the rise of what we have come to know and to love or to not love, and it's called what? Anyone? Fake news. Right? If you want to know where the epicenter of fake news is, it comes out of this recipe where you have a combination of official news organizations, governments, and 7.4 billion journalists. Out of that recipe comes this blurred space that many of us have come to know as fake news, right? In other words, what is real and how do you believe it? And how do you know that you can believe it, right? Now, I see some of you taking notes, and I just want to make sure that you know that I have given my notes, like my 6 pages of notes that I'm presenting today. I've given those to Pastor Felipe, and I have given him full rights to get it to anyone who's interested, right? So please know that those notes are available for you to study later. Okay, so let's move on from there. We were talking about the blurred lines of fake news. Here's someone who is speaking about it. Sally Lerman at The Atlantic, a very well-respected journal in the United States. The digital world has made into mud formerly clear divisions between factual news, sales pitches, hoaxes, and hyper-partisan propaganda designed to incite. These are some of the disadvantages of having this democratized journalism. All right, so in response to democratized journalism, several organizations have gotten together to begin talking about this idea of transparency in journalism. Pay very close attention because I think this is one of the most important topics that we'll deal with here this afternoon. Transparency in journalism. So from this perspective, over 75 news organizations from around the world have come together to sign on to a process or an initiative called the Trust Project, right? The Trust Project. And in fact, let's see, we will see at some point in time. Yes, okay, so here is basically the homepage for the Trust Project. And clearly you can see what their goal is. News with integrity. We all think we can tell the difference between opinion advertising and accurate news, but how do we really know? How do we really know? So this is the Trust Project, and both Google and Facebook have signed on to what this group of 75 news organizations have developed called trust indicators. There are some indicators that tell you whether you can mostly, again, let's not be Walt Disney, whether you can mostly trust a news source versus whether you can't. Okay, so I've put together a little screen here showing you some of the news organizations, only some among the 75 that signed on. And you have some pretty significant news organizations from all over the world that you may recognize. From the States, we recognize The Economist and The Washington Post, major players there in the United States that are saying enough is enough, and we need to be able to distinguish between fake news and real news, right? So here's a quote about transparency from the Trust Project. These are the organizers of the Trust Project who on their website say, it turns out readers don't just want to weed out imposters. In other words, to pick between the weeds and the good plants. They want to know who wrote or produced a story, what expertise they have, and whether the publisher has an agenda. And look at this last bit. Transparency matters. Transparency matters. All right. Here's another one, very quick, from the from the Trust Project, where they interviewed people in London. People tended to be loyal to one or two news sites that had won their trust. They checked these news sources every day. Now begin thinking about the Adventist Church, little by little. Begin thinking about your work as a journalist, as a communication director. People tended to be loyal to one or two news sites that had won their trust. They checked these every day, right? This is in London. Now, there's another consideration. Let me actually go back so that we don't read ahead. There's a second consideration to the transparency trend, and that is the millennial generation. The millennial generation is now between 22 years old and 37 years old. So now get a mental picture of that. 22 years old and 37 years old. And this generation, on average, around the world, has a unified set of values. And one of the values that is common to millennials around the world is the need for transparency. Millennials are very skeptical of organizations in general. They're not like our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents that just trusted the organization because that was what was right to do. More and more within this millennial group, and notice the millennials aren't teenagers anymore. They're taking leadership positions. They're working their way up in their companies. They're working their way up in the local churches on church boards. They're being assigned positions of responsibility in conferences and unions, right? 22 to 37 years old, these millennials have as one of their core values transparency, which means that institutions have to work harder and harder to gain their trust and to maintain their trust. I want to share with you a couple of my favorite quotations from magazines in the United States that deal with business. Forbes magazine and Entrepreneur magazine. They deal with business and branding. But as we read these, begin to think about our own church. Begin to think that we have a brand. You've heard others who come from the General Conference who are saying we have a brand promise. Pastor Sam Nevis was one of those who introduced us to some of these branding ideas. And so essentially, as you begin to look at these quotes, don't think that it only deals with cars and food and film. It has everything to do with a brand of a company, which is basically the reputation that a company has in its community. So take a look. This is all about millennials. Brands must share far more detailed information than ever before. This unprecedented level of transparency must go beyond advertising and mandatory disclosures. Well, we have to tell them that. It goes beyond mandatory disclosures for brands to succeed with this coveted millennial demographic. When a brand offers complete transparency, 94% of survey respondents are likely to be loyal to that brand. And when consumers switch to a brand in favor of increased transparency, they are likely to stay for the long haul. In fact, 56% said that they would be very likely to stay loyal to a completely transparent brand for life. 78% of all survey respondents said they trust a brand more if it offers product transparency. It is clear that trust is the new currency of brand loyalty, Forbes magazine. Just another quick one from Entrepreneur magazine. While previous generations may have happily employed a ignorance is bliss mindset, when it came to how products were produced, this socially conscious demographic wants the brands they engage with to be open and honest. The more forthright you can be regarding your brand history, product development, and overall consumer initiatives, the higher chance you'll have of building up trust and eventually loyalty. Entrepreneur magazine. All right, so this idea of transparency is very critical for us, and we'll talk about it just a little bit later. Number 3, the third trend is called vertical storytelling. Vertical storytelling, we heard from one of the other presenters here, Camilo, I believe his name was. He was talking to us about vertical storytelling when it comes to vlogging. But vertical storytelling is actually very much a trend in journalism as well. So let's talk about just a little bit about that vertical storytelling. So there is a statistic that will not come as any surprise to any of us, and that is that we hold our phones, our mobile devices, in the vertical position 95% of the time. 95% of the time. So the journalistic industry has decided that they have to figure out ways in which to tell stories from vertical perspectives, right? So I want to share with you just a couple of samples. So this is the BBC. The BBC, by the way, I don't know if you know this, they have an entire research and development arm at the BBC. All they do, all day long, is to look at the future. All day long. And they're exploring and experimenting with better ways for the BBC to engage with its audience. Take a look at some of these screenshots. They have four things that they do now with vertical storytelling. Number 1, summary. They provide a very quick vertical summary of the story. So if your article is 800 words, 1,000 words, here it is boiled down into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 quick bullets in vertical format. Let's take a look at the next one. Hyperlocal. So one thing that they're doing with this vertical format is at the very top of the vertical, you'll see where the arrow is. It basically says you're about to be signed in with your postcode. Did you see that? So in other words, your postcode will determine some of the news articles that will very quickly flow into your news feed from the BBC, so hyperlocal. The third one that they're doing is called perspective. Remember, I shared with you that one of the critical roles of journalism is to share multiple perspectives about an issue, right? Again, very critical for us as Adventist journalists to grapple with. Multiple perspectives on an issue. Look at what they do at the bottom. So in a very, very interactive way, at the bottom, you can actually see that there are different little video vignettes and audio vignettes from, it's very difficult, I'm sure, for you to see, but one says police chief, the other one says an anti-violence campaigner, the third one says a professor of criminology. So all of this about one story about knife violence in London, and at the bottom you can click and see and hear perspectives from various voices within the community. Perspective. Then the third one is simplify. Actually, this is the fourth one. Simplify. So this is very fascinating. I found this probably the most fascinating of all. So because we know that the attention spans are decreasing when people are on their devices, they don't want to read extremely long content, here's what the BBC is doing. They're taking some of their content and they're creating ways in which you can have a shorter version. So take a look at that yellow piece, and you see where that paragraph has a little button called explain. Well, they want to tell you more, but they know that most of you won't read more. But they give you the option for more. So watch what happens when you click explain. It opens up into a longer paragraph. Now, clearly, this requires a lot of people to work on every article to make it do this. But I'm showing you some trends in journalism where journalists and editors are realizing that people want to read shorter, but they don't just want to stop at short. They want to give you more. And so essentially, in this one way, you're able to get both the short and the long versions of a particular paragraph. So that is what that's what the BBC is doing. Then there is another interesting. There's another interesting a trend that's going on within this idea of telling vertical stories, and that is we're moving away from scrolling little by little. You may not notice this a lot now, but you will notice it increasingly. So scrolling, where you basically take your device and you scroll up and the story is a very long vertical story, we're moving away from that. That used to be called scrollytelling. I think it only makes sense in the English language. You have storytelling with scrolling. So scrollytelling is moving away. And rather, we now have stories that are broken up into individual little mini episodes, even cards, and you have to swipe between them or you tap your phone to go between those cards. So let me give you a couple of examples of those. This is Korea. In Korea, they are crazy about card news. Card news. In fact, we were in Korea, a team from Adventist Review, and we were told that the Adventist communication team in Korea takes news articles from Adventist World magazine, they translate them into Korean, and then they make these cards out of them. Now, this is not an example of the Advent story, but take a look at what you have here. You've got 4 unique cards that take a news story and turn them into a very media-rich type of environment where you can click on the side, you can see click, 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 and it takes you through the cards. And at the very bottom, you see you have a summary or at least a timeline of the cards that make up the story. And so we were told that with Adventist World Stories, they basically standardize on about 10 cards. 10 cards per news story, and this is the way that they send it out to their readers in Korea. Then let's take a look at Google. Now, this is a tool that every single one of you can use tomorrow. It's called AMP, and Google has created a product, AMP stands for Accelerated Mobile Pages, that will allow you to quickly generate vertical card stories of your article in a very short amount of time. So what you see here, once again, this is from Google AMP. This allows you to create vertical cards of your news story that engage people from a visual perspective, from an interactive perspective. And so this is what's happening in the world of storytelling that is vertical or vertical storytelling. Very quickly, we move on to the 4th trend. The 4th trend is called iterative journalism. Iterative journalism. It's a difficult word even in English, and I'm sure translating it is even more difficult. An iteration. An iteration means one version of something. So if you have multiple versions of something, you have multiple iterations of that. And so iterative journalism is this type of journalism that has multiple versions of one article. So let me tell you what this looks like. Iterative journalism focuses on speed and catching your attention. Pay very close attention. Even before it is known whether that news story is totally accurate or not. Now, you want to hear another contributor to fake news. In its worst forms, because there's some advantages. I told you we were looking at advantages and disadvantages. In its worst forms, iterative journalism contributes to fake news. Why? Because the journalistic landscape is so competitive that news outlets are trying to put together news stories that are quick and partial and just get them out there quickly so that people can see them, so that people can start talking about them, and so that their news organization gets the scoop on these issues. So the practice involves many iterations because the news organization will post a very quick version of the story with a very catchy title, and then they'll say, updates will follow. And they may not know whether that's completely accurate or not, but they're going to put it out there quickly. So here's what happens. Once they put it out quickly, people begin to react to it. Readers, viewers, they begin to comment on it. They will take those comments from those readers and viewers and will figure out how to make updates to the story, right? Other news organizations will see this first iteration, this first news story, and they will then take it and develop it further, and then so everyone is feeding off of each other. And what you'll find is news stories, well, it was updated now, and 2 hours later there's a little update, and then 4 hours later there's another update. This is iterative journalism, and it is done more and more and more, increasingly more. Now, here are the advantages. Again, we're trying to be balanced in our understanding of these concepts. The advantages are that it does allow a breaking story to be released early. Even if they don't know all the facts, they're releasing a breaking story early, and it prompts, as I said earlier, other news outlets to jump on it and to develop the story, to look into their sources to bring about even more information for the story to be developed, right? That's one advantage. It also engages audiences in crowdsourcing and uncovering even more information about a particular story, more details that come from the crowd. So it does allow that. And it does use psychology to frame a story. Most of these iterative journalistic stories have very compelling titles. Some would even call them sensationalistic titles. So one advantage is that you grab a person's attention and you immediately engage that reader into something that they may not have engaged with in another form. So those are some of the advantages. This is a quote from a journalist who is also the head of research and development at the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal in the United States. So he speaks positively about this kind of trend in general. And he says, this is human-centered reporting. Iterative journalism begins with people, but it looks beyond just demographic data to understand how individuals feel and what they need when seeking news. Iterative journalism is empathic journalism. Empathetic journalism, actually. It uses audience interviews, surveys, analysis of comments, and observation to learn what readers care about, not just how many of them there are. So those journalists who are more interested in understanding the way people read, they really value this type of journalism. That is, it's almost like exploring a topic in real time with the rest of the world, which is a very different model than old school traditional journalism, where the journalist worked on the 1,500-word investigative report, and then the next morning it was in the New York Times, right? Very different with this concept of iterative journalism. But, of course, there are also some disadvantages. Many times, so follow with me, many times you have your first initial short breaking news story, and you say to them, updates will come. Well, in that first news story, you may not actually have all your facts right, but it doesn't matter because you have the ability, because we're living online, to update the story. And many of the updates actually contain the facts because now you've taken some time and you've actually uncovered the facts, and now you're including them in your update. Here's the problem. Many, many social scientists are also saying that many, many readers won't ever come back for the update. Right? Did you hear what I just said? Many readers, some social scientists argue, will never come back for the second update. So guess what they're stuck with in their mind as reality? The very first iteration, the very first news story that is put out is what's stuck in their mind as reality. Now it begins to inform everything. It begins to inform their worldview. Now they begin to argue with their neighbor about this thing. Yes, but I saw it in the news. Now it begins to fuel this kind of this political tension that we have. So there's a remarkable downside to iterative journalism as well. Here's, in fact, it can lead to a breaking of trust between the public and news organizations. So here's someone, Ryan Holiday, who wrote a book called "Trust Me, I'm Lying." He was a publicist who called himself a web manipulator. Like he did this for a living. He stopped. He wrote a book about it called Trust Me, I'm Lying. And here's what he says. The economies of the internet create a twisted set of incentives that make traffic more important and more profitable than the truth. This is a predictable pattern that can be exploited. And iterative journalism has a lot to do with generating traffic and generating it fast. Okay, here's another quote. The problem for journalists is that there really isn't very much that's newsworthy. But in order to drive clicks, spectacles need to be constantly invented. Right? So you can argue that iterative journalism is basically creating spectacles in order to gain traffic, in order to keep the readers for what you hope are future versions of the article that they may never, ever see. All right. And I think that takes us through that portion of it. Now, we go to the next trend, and that is called demand-based journalism. Probably, if you ask me today, what are you most concerned about or most passionate about when it comes to journalism, this is it, right? So if you need a quick sort of wake me up moment, this is the moment, because we need to grapple with this concept called, or that I have at least called, demand-based journalism. So here's what we're talking about. Demand-based journalism is the practice of gathering and disseminating the type of news that a news outlet perceives its audience wants. Right? Just live with that for just a second. Demand-based journalism is where a news organization says, well, we know what our audience wants, so we will give them just that. Okay, advantages. We're being fair. Number one, the content is aligned with the interests of the readers. That's not a bad thing. Don't ever think that's a bad thing. The content is aligned with the interest of the readers. We do have to generate content that interests readers. Otherwise, no one will read our content. Right? So it's not a bad thing in and of itself. Here's a second advantage. More people will engage with your material. If you've figured out your audience and you give them exactly what they want, the statistics say that more people will engage with your material. You're happy, your boss is happy, everyone's happy, and everyone collects their paycheck at the end of the day. However, we're not dealing with marketing here. We're not talking about public relations today, even though we've talked about the very good relationship between public relations and journalism. We're talking about journalism. And the role of journalism is to inform the public in a fair and in a balanced way by providing accurate facts and making sense of those facts for our audience. Here's a person who is commenting about this issue. He is the director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism and a professor of political communication at the University of Oxford. Right? Pretty well-informed person. And he writes, the shift thus has to be about better and more distinct journalism in an incredibly competitive battle for attention, about a greater focus on what readers actually value. So there are two sides of that coin. The first side is he's absolutely right. It's a very competitive environment, and we want people to read or to watch or to listen to the content that we're creating as journalists. However, flip that side of the coin to the other side, and here's what this professor actually says. With a greater focus on what the readers actually want. Here are the disadvantages. Pay very close attention. If this were to be true, it reinforces and further develops a news organization's bias. do you wonder how we get news organizations that are very biased? Like in the United States, I can tell you, we can do a whole spectrum, and I can tell you where many of the main news organizations are. Are they far left? Are they far right? How do you think we get to that point? One of the ways that we get to that point is because we just feed our readers what they want to continue to read and to watch and to listen to. And the more a news outlet limits its content to its target audience and what that target audience needs, the more narrow its perspective. I would love to talk to editors from some of these major news outlets and to push them and to challenge them to think about what that means. That the more they give their readers what they want, the more narrow and the more narrow and the more narrow their perspective tends to be. So now, they're not just biased, they're super biased. They're not just biased, the news organization is actually 100% politically motivated on one end of the spectrum or another. Something crazy is happening in our world, and it comes from this incessant need that we have to give the audience only what it wants. Okay? Another disadvantage is that this is perfectly fine when it relates to various items in terms of marketing and right, in terms of connecting with your audience. We want to make sure that you give them what they want, but it's very dangerous when ideologies are involved. If you recognize that your audience only has this particular bandwidth of ideologies and you say, hey, let's continue to feed that audience with this particular ideology, what do you think happens? One word: extremism. Just think about it for a second. The more you feed that audience what they want ideologically, the more extreme they will become in their views, because very few people actually listen or read or watch several different news sources at once. They have their favorites. I'm sure some of you have your favorites, and that's where you live. That's where you live. So the challenge with this on-demand journalism is that it provides us with an ethical dilemma. And here's the ethical dilemma. If we only feed readers and viewers what they actually value or what they actually want, are we being responsible purveyors of truth? Are we being responsible disseminators of truth? That's a very, very challenging ethical question. And here's the next question that follows it. Is society really benefiting if all we're doing is sharing with our audience what they want? Is society benefiting from that or not? These are some of the things we have to grapple with in a very, very real way. And at the same time, if the audience truly wants it, I've thought about this a lot, if the audience truly wants it, and you know they want it, perhaps the best job you can do is to feed it to them in the most accurate way and in the most fair and balanced way. Perhaps there's no way to get around the fact that an audience wants what it wants. That's why we call it an ethical dilemma. It's not easy to solve at all. So here we are with our ethical dilemma, and I've come across a quote that I thought was fairly balanced. In 2019, this is the CEO and the publisher of the MIT. MIT is the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, one of our Ivy League schools there in the United States, of the MIT Technology Review. She says in 2019, I think we'll see successful media companies get much more reflective about why their audiences read them or why they don't. What do these many varied and highly intimate interactions, clicks, say about the hopes, dreams, and fears of the human beings behind them? How can these insights drive deeper, stronger connections? This is, I think, a very balanced way to look at it. We do need to understand our audiences. We do need to understand why they make that click in particular. We do need to understand that. But in essence, rather than saying, okay, let's give them more of that, it should actually just have us question, who are these human beings? Why do they want this? And how can we create more deeper and stronger connections between our organization, our news organization, and these people? Because even though we will give them some of what they want, there are other things that may be beneficial to them that they don't necessarily want, but if we have a strong bond with them, we can actually get them to consider some other perspectives as well. This is, I think, a fairly balanced way to look at the whole thing. All right, so now we come to the last part. And the last part concerns itself with the Adventist church. So we've talked here and there about how these concepts interact with the church, but let's now take the last part of it, and then we'll leave time for questions and answers. And I really hope you have questions. And I really hope that you have really great comments. I also want to hear what you think and what you've experienced. So get those questions ready in your mind. So let's look at journalism in the Adventist church. Our current challenges are these, if I were to break them down to just a couple. Number one, we have very few breaking news stories in the Adventist church. Even though breaking news happens every day all over the world, we Adventists are really good at news that's like 2 weeks old. And I can tell you that with 100% accuracy, because working as the global news editor of the Adventist Review and Adventist World, you kind of get a sense of what's happening around the world, and you see in real time how long it takes for something like that to turn into a news story. In one part of the world, a very important leader passed away in one of our organizations, and passed away in a tragic way. And that news had to get out. It literally took them a week, one solid week, to get a news story together about the death of that person, because they literally had to check with, and we'll talk about this just a little bit, they had to check with 5 different committees and 3 different administrators, and by the time it came to the global level, it was a week old. This happens over and over and over and over again. So we're very, very poor at sharing breaking news stories. The second challenge is that we have even fewer transparent news stories. This is an area that we struggle with the most in the church, is our understanding of the balance between public relations and journalism. And we'll talk about this just a little bit more, but we tend to make the assumption that if we were to create a news story that is accurate, that is fair, that is balanced, that allows the church to use its best voice to speak about a tough issue, that somehow we're being disloyal to our church. Did you hear what I just said? Somehow that assumption is made that we really can't be journalists, because somehow if we were to talk about these issues, that they would not be very welcomed by leaders within the organization and perhaps even the audience. So anyhow, these are some of the things we are struggling with. There are no easy answers to them, but we have to at least begin to talk about them more and more and more. So here are 3 goals that I want to present to you, and I'll put them there on the screen just so you can know kind of where we're going. Goal number 1 within the Adventist Church is we need to generate faster official communication. Faster official communication that is also certainly accurate. We don't really want to go towards the iterative journalism where we put something out without really knowing. At least when we do put out the first iteration of a story, let's at least make sure that what we know is accurate. And we can say we don't know a lot of things, and that will come, but here's what we know for sure. This individual has died, has passed away. This major cataclysmic event has happened in our community. Something very positive has occurred as well. So we need to create a way of doing that and to create a system for getting news quickly from local fields. I won't go into this now, but I'll just tell you that we're working collaboratively with many, many people and divisions around the world to create a system like that. And you'll hear more about that from the South American division as we get closer to being able to unveil it, right? So we are creating a system and hoping that it will help solve part of this problem. Here is the other part of this goal, is we have to recognize our challenges to being fast. And I already mentioned kind of jokingly one of them, and that is administrative bottlenecks. What that means is that as communicators, as journalists, we may be working very quickly, but then it hits the wall when we begin engaging with our administrators. Now, I can say this with all due respect to my fellow administrators, because I served as a vice president in a very large conference in the United States, and I've been communication professional and administrator, and at the same time functioning in both roles. So I understand that administration many times is very risk averse, many times. And that even though you're working very fast, once it gets to administration, it begins to hit a wall. That is a reality that we have to recognize, but we can't simply stop there. We have to figure out a way to work very well with our administrations more and more so that we can get news past that bottleneck very, very quickly. Very, very quickly. We have to recognize the challenge, and we have to work our way towards it. The other challenge, by the way, and I'll give you a perspective on this, is you may be a communication director, and you've got 16 things that you're doing simultaneously. Your portfolio as a communication director involves many, many, many different things, and now you've got this breaking news story, and you simply don't have time for it. That's another reality. It's another challenge. So let's talk about some tips, approaches to easing this challenge. Number one, make it as easy as possible for your administrators. Some of you work in the same office, and you're either your president or your executive secretary or whoever's in charge of making a particular decision is there in the office that week, but you send this thing by email, and you say, I've emailed you this draft for the breaking news story, and we're hoping very much that you can get to it soon. If it's truly a breaking news story, print out the story on paper, take it to the administrator, knock on their door, go into a meeting, apologize, and say, this is a breaking news story, and we're trying to release it very, very quickly. If you have a moment, just take a look at it. You have to be, to some degree, bold, right? You have to be more like a Daniel and a Joseph, who's very respectful, very appropriate, but bold enough to say to an administrator, this is important for you to look at. Now, if possible, sir, right? So you have to figure out ways in which you can be bold to get this thing in front of an administrator so we don't reach that bottleneck and then the news story a week later is still stuck on the desk of the administrator or in a committee somewhere. So we have to work in respectful ways, but in bold ways to try to get that story through. Then we have to begin more and more, especially when it comes to breaking stories that are crisis-related stories, we have to convince our administrators, maybe some of you are in the room, I'm hoping that there are some administrators in the room, that we only have one chance, listen carefully, one chance to use our voice as an organization to tell this story accurately. One chance. Because if it is truly a breaking story, if it is truly an important story, then if we miss that moment to tell our own story, others will tell it for us. Others will tell it for us. So we have to begin to create compelling ways in which we can convince administrators that this is our one moment right here to tell this story. Because if we don't, then the other news media that are not owned and operated by the church will jump on it immediately. Or one of the 7.4 billion journalists will jump on it and tell the story on social media, right? Which they do all the time. And then we talked about the fact that you may be really busy. And believe me, I know. But consider this. If it's a breaking news story that affects real people, and not only real people in your community, but because we're such an interconnected world, real people around the world who care very much about what's happening or may have relatives in that certain area, breaking news stories are important for all of us to make priorities out of. So you may be working on the marketing proposal, right? And you may be working on an assignment that your boss gave you to, interact with some committee on some communication-related function. But when a breaking news story happens, that story needs to float to the surface. And we need to begin to prioritize more and more and more when it comes to these breaking stories. All right, number 2 goal. Oops, sorry. Let me go back. They're already on the board. Goal number 2 is to have a clear protocol for crisis and sensitive news. So when a crisis happens, and by the way, let's define a crisis. A crisis isn't always negative. A crisis could actually be a positive development in your local church or conference or union or division. If something really big happens, if someone wins the Nobel Peace Prize in your local church, that's a crisis, right? Why? Because all the attention of the world is going to be focused on suddenly your little community. So a crisis is not just something negative that happens to an organization, it's anything that impacts the reputation of that organization, anything. So here's the first tip to this challenge. If you have a crisis or a possible crisis, immediately alert more and more your division and, of course, the general conference. The divisions do a good job at alerting us when something is happening, and we need to do more of that. Also, as a communication professional, when you're involved in crisis communication, always say something. So now you're the chief journalist for your conference or your union. A crisis ensues, and the local media immediately get a hold of this, and they call you. So you're writing your own story about it, but you're also getting reporters calling you. Here is the tip that I want to give you that we have now shared with general conference leaders in the entire building of the general conference, and we've shared it with them multiple times. When a reporter asks you to comment, never say no comment. Never respond to that inquiry with silence. Now, let me ask you a question. The last time you read an article or heard a news report in which it said the company was contacted for comment but did not give a comment, what do you think in your mind immediately? Say it out loud. What do you think? Guilty. I heard the word guilty. Right. Immediately we make this judgment, this value judgment, that if you say no comment or they were not available for comment, they are hiding something. Now, they may not be hiding anything. They just might have a really bad public relations director. They may not be hiding anything, but immediately in the court of public opinion, the perception is that they're hiding something. So if you're called by a reporter, immediately engage in the conversation. Jose, thank you so much for calling. This is a very important issue. We are looking into it right now. Let me tell you, we don't know a whole lot because you've heard about it, we've just heard about it. But let me tell you, when we find out the information behind this, we will definitely contact you. In other words, have a conversation in which you say nothing, but you say a lot. You don't have to give any insights at that point in time, but you do need to establish a human-to-human connection. Right? It's the same thing with, let's say, the General Conference or Adventist Review. We call you and we say, hey, we've heard that this is going on. Well, Pastor, we can't, I don't know, no comment. Rather than that, say, yes, we don't know whether this is true or not, but we're looking into it now. Thank you for bringing it to our attention. I'll call you within the next couple of hours to tell you if we found out anything or not. So always you want to make sure that you have this idea of communication. Then the third goal is to increase our level of transparency. We talked about that a lot, and I just want to give you an example as we go into our question and answer time. I think the best example of transparency in the Adventist Church from a journalism perspective came out of the East Central Africa Division just a few months ago. Some of you know that in Africa, whenever we have evangelistic meetings, the response is very large. A lot of people getting baptized. And as far as, and I'm sure that some of you have also read some of the criticism that comes because of the fact that not everyone who then gets baptized, this is basically around the world, the reality is not everyone who gets baptized stays in the church. East Central Africa Division, a few months ago, passed the 4 million member mark, right? They are the largest division and the first division to report over 4 million Adventist members. They could have left it at that. They could have just had public relations. But they didn't. The director of communication for the East Central Africa Division wrote the story himself, and he had the first part as this amazing report on the 4 million membership, all kinds of quotes and celebrations, and then the last part of the article, he included this. Now, we also know here in East Central Africa that many people who are baptized don't end up staying with the church. This is a real issue for us. We've already met on several occasions to try to figure out how to change things so that when people become baptized, they are taken into the life of the church and brought into sort of a discipleship journey so that they can stay with the church. We know this is a problem, and we're going to address it. Wow. You see? So they allowed, and by the way, the division president was quoted right there. Yes, this is an issue. Yes, we're on top of it. Yes, we're going to fix this thing. Somehow we're going to solve this issue within our division. This was one of the best examples of faith-based journalism within the church, in which we're open, honest, transparent, and gaining the trust of our audiences everywhere. Thank you very much. I think we're done with the main presentation, and then we can take some questions and answers. Thank you for your attention, everyone.
Muito bem, pessoal. Nós temos que ficar realmente dentro do tempo. Agradecemos muito ao...
I don't have... Can you translate the question?
No?
I don't have my...
No.
No, let me try it.
Agradecemos ao Costin por esses momentos aqui. Nós temos tempo aqui, pelo que eu vejo, apenas para uma pergunta. E aí, as demais dúvidas, nós podemos conversar depois diretamente com ele. Ele vai continuar conosco aqui durante todo o evento. Muito bem. Temos uma pergunta, então.
Costin, do you think it's valid for us to post on social media first the short version of breaking news for buyers time to write the long version and complete version on the website and portal? Do you think it's valid for us to do this?
Yes, it's a very good question, and I do think it's valid as long as what we say is accurate. In other words, even if you know very little, don't try to say more just to get the interest of the audience. This is where the ethical line comes. So make the headline very engaging, but stick with only what you know. Yes, I think it's very appropriate, though.
One more question. Tem mais uma? Deu tempo. Quem? Quer dizer...
Gente, estou pressionada que eu não consigo falar inglês, mas é o seguinte. Você acha que, de repente, um dos objetivos que poderiam ser acrescentados, na verdade, já deve estar nos planos, mas ser mais enfatizado, iniciativas com a tecnologia e informação na igreja? Eu falo porque eu acho que, às vezes, as nossas notícias elas não estão andando lado a lado com a tecnologia, então não chega mais rápido, porque, sei lá, o nosso site, às vezes, precisa de algumas melhoras que eu já vejo acontecendo e tem planos, inclusive, já passaram para nós em reuniões, né, que a divisão junto com a Associação Geral tem planos muito bons sobre isso, mas também em apps e coisas assim, para que a nossa notícia chegue onde realmente está com as pessoas que é no celular, na mão, no site, mas iniciativas assim diretas, porque às vezes o conteúdo pode ser ótimo, mas as frases são bem boladas, mas elas não têm caminhos diretos.
Yes. So I hear what you're saying. I believe I hear what you're saying. And that is, many times we have stories that are happening on the ground, but number one, because of the technology that may not be so well developed, or maybe for other reasons, it doesn't quickly get to the public. Yes. So there are two challenges very quickly. The first challenge is technological. Sometimes we do have technological bottlenecks. as you're describing, sometimes the technology, so yes, we do need to solve that. I mentioned earlier that we, and what I mean by we, the world field together, are working on a concept and a platform that could change everything for all of us, right? And you'll hear more about that. But the second set of challenges is also the idea of leadership within communication and then all the way up to administrative leadership, allowing those stories to quickly get to the public. And I think we have to grapple with the fact that if we don't change that culture, we will be very slow as compared to the world in which we live. The pace of the news in the world is very quick while we are like turtles. We have to grapple with that. It's not going to be fun, but we have to talk about this issue.
Uma misericórdia possibilitou mais alguma pergunta. Lucas?
Olá, meu nome é Lucas e eu vou fazer pergunta em português mesmo. Aqui no Brasil a gente já tem uma dificuldade em relação a notícias de uma forma geral, já que boa parte da nossa população sequer sabe ler e muitos que sabem ler sequer sabem interpretar a informação. Então, de certa forma, o texto, que é a matéria-prima base do jornalismo, ele não tem muita entrada, não consegue atingir muito o público. E, obviamente, as pessoas estão nas redes sociais, mas sabemos que, ao tentar alcançar essas pessoas nas redes sociais, a gente utiliza técnicas de marketing, copywriting, e isso acaba fazendo com que o nosso jornalismo perca um pouco esse critério que você apresentou e se pareça mais com as relações públicas. Levando em vista essa tensão entre público, aqui no Brasil, principalmente, que não é tão letrado assim, e o fôlego do conteúdo, qual é o caminho que você aponta? Para qual desses dois lados a gente deve pender? Para o lado do público ou do lado do conteúdo?
Do we have another 3 hours? No, 20 seconds. If we can in 20 seconds, that is the question. How do we do that? I don't think that we should stop. Please listen carefully. I don't think we should stop trying to figure out how to connect better with our audiences, right? But I do also think that we need to really, really work hard to make content compelling for the audience, even though it may not be the most marketable content. Right? There's a social responsibility that we have as journalists. What we do sometimes is we get really lazy and we just make it sound really boring. We don't take a lot of time to think from psychological perspectives. If you read really great newspapers, you can see that their headlines many times are really great. They work hard at the headlines. So we don't stop working on ways to market good news. We just have to produce solid journalism and then make it compelling enough for people to pay attention to. Now that, again, it sounds very Disneyland, but that's what we have to at least try to get to, is a solid commitment to content and also a solid commitment to a connection with our audience. Maybe you can come up with a seminar a few years from now to tell us how you were able to grapple with that. It's not an easy solution, but it's something that all of us together can work on to get to. Excellent question, by the way. Excellent. I think we're done.
Muito bem.
Yes, our host is in the back.
Estamos por aqui, fica tranquilo, amigo. Mais uma pergunta. Vai.
Hello. We're working in Chile. And there's, in Santiago, actually, the capital, we have a very secular ambient there. So the media is very hard to cover us in different, with the news that we produce. The difference with here, that they normally get to the news papers or the TV, and we can't do that. Maybe we need to do a work in relationships, in public relationships, or find another way, but we want to start doing it. I'm proposing to have some meetings with media leaders, like for trying to get some public relationships.
Right.
But I'm not sure if that's the right way to do it because of the secular media where we are doing our journalistic job. So what do you suggest for this kind of cases?
Sure. I've done a lot of media relations, and one of the things I've discovered about media outlets and specifically reporters, they want to know how this particular event or issue or topic is impacting the people in that area, right? They don't very much care that this has some global implications or some, global ties with Adventists around the world. So find ways to communicate to your media outlets, this is ways in which what we're doing is impacting the lives of these specific people, right? The second way that I would encourage you to do is to study what's already important to those communities. Like many Adventist churches, they sit in a room and they say, well, what shall we do? And they ask themselves, what's important to us? Or what do our doctrines say? Or what? That's not as important as asking the question, which Jesus, by the way, asked every day of his life on earth, what is important to this person in front of me? Right? And once you understand what's important to that person, then you create ministries that are effective in reaching the people where they already are. Now you get to the point where in media relations, you can say, the Adventist Church has connected with this initiative in this community. We didn't create the initiative, they did, but we partnered. We gave 300 volunteers. We donated 50,000 of your currency or whatever. In other words, rather than the Adventist Church trying to say, we came up with something, go to what's already important to the community and partner with that, then tell the news reporters this partnership is happening. There are many ways in which we can create moments that the media outlets will pay attention to because we are somehow meeting the needs of the local church. If I had time, I would tell you about the mega clinics called Pathway to Health. I serve as Director of Communication as a volunteer for Pathway to Health. Every major city in the United States, Los Angeles, you name it, every major news outlet was there reporting many times. Why? Because these Adventists from all over the world are coming and they're giving free medical care to 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 people in 3 days, and they're not asking anything in return, right? Nothing. So there are ways, and you're right, the challenge is how do you attract the attention of the secular society that sees the church as kind of like marginal or irrelevant. So the challenge is start being relevant, right? In other words, remember the cultural intersections that I talked about with ARTV. That question needs to be on our minds. How do we intersect culturally in our communities? Then the media will start paying attention more and more and more. Because it's not about us, it's about our community.
Muito bem. Agora sim, muito obrigado. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pastor Felipe. And thank you guys for paying
Muito
attention
obrigado,
for a long time.
Costin. Muito obrigado mesmo. Amigos, agora vamos aguardar que em instantes nós vamos ter a continuidade da nossa programação. Então, podemos ficar por aqui. Daqui a pouquinho nós vamos ter a continuidade.